August 15th, 1943. A scorching Texas afternoon. The transport trucks rumbled through the gates of Camp Clarion, carrying their cargo of defeated men. Dust clouds rose from the unpaved roads as 147 German prisoners of war arrived at what would become their home for the duration of the conflict. Local residents lined the perimeter fence, some curious, others openly hostile, watching as enemy soldiers stepped onto American soil. Among them was 24-year-old Margaret Brennan, a corporal in the Women's Army Corps, who stood at attention beside the processing station. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in regulation style, her uniform pressed despite the relentless heat. She had volunteered for guard duty at the new POW facility, believing it was her duty to serve after her brother Tommy had been killed at Guadalcanal 6 months earlier. She expected to feel hatred when she saw the German prisoners. She had prepared herself for it, rehearsed the cold professionalism she would maintain. But when Friedrich Weber stepped down from the third truck, something unexpected happened. He was 26 years old, a former schoolteacher from Munich, who had been captured in North Africa after his unit surrendered to British forces. His blonde hair was darkened with sweat and dust, his gray uniform torn at the shoulder. He carried himself with quiet dignity despite obvious exhaustion, helping an older prisoner navigate the truck's steep steps before descending himself. Their eyes met for only a moment. Less than 3 seconds of direct contact before Maggie forced herself to look away. But in that brief glance, she saw something that contradicted everything she had been told about the enemy. She saw weariness, yes, but also intelligence, kindness, and something else she couldn't quite name. A fundamental humanity that made him look less like a monster and more like someone who could have been her neighbor back in Philadelphia. Friedrich noticed her too. Among the hard faces of the American guards, hers stood out. Not because she looked friendly, she maintained the same stern expression as the others, but because he saw in her eyes a flicker of something beyond simple duty. Conflict, perhaps. Uncertainty. The recognition that the men stepping off these trucks were not the demonic figures portrayed in propaganda posters. The processing took 4 hours. Prisoners were photographed, fingerprinted, issued identification numbers, and assigned to barracks. Throughout it all, Maggie found her gaze returning to the tall German with a gentle manner, watching how he translated instructions for prisoners who spoke no English, how he maintained calm when others grew agitated. She told herself it was simply her job to observe the prisoners, to identify potential troublemakers or leaders. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that she was lying to herself. Something had begun in that first moment of eye contact, something that would challenge everything she believed about duty, loyalty, and the true nature of the enemy. The first weeks at Camp Clarion established the rhythm of captivity. Prisoners rose at dawn, worked in nearby cotton fields, or performed maintenance duties around the facility, and returned to their barracks at dusk. The Texas heat was merciless, far different from anything most of the German soldiers had experienced in Europe. Guards maintained strict protocols. No fraternization beyond necessary communication. No personal conversations, no exchange of items or information not directly related to camp operations. These rules were printed on signs throughout the facility, in both English and German, constant reminders of the boundary that must exist between captor and captive. Maggie took her duties seriously. She patrolled the wire perimeter during her shifts, supervised work details, and filed reports with the same precision she had learned in basic training. But she couldn't help noticing how the prisoners organized themselves, how they shared resources, how Friedrich in particular seemed to serve as an unofficial mediator when disputes arose among the men. She watched him teach English phrases to younger prisoners during their limited free time, using a stick to write words in the dirt of the recreation yard. His patience was remarkable, repeating pronunciations until his students could form the unfamiliar sounds. It was on a particularly brutal afternoon in early September that the first small gesture occurred. Maggie was supervising a work detail, repairing a section of fence damaged in a recent storm. Friedrich was among the 12 prisoners assigned to the task. The temperature had climbed above 100 degrees, and one of the younger Germans, a boy who couldn't have been more than 19, collapsed from heat exhaustion. Friedrich immediately moved to help him, loosening his collar and calling for water in German. Maggie made a split-second decision that violated protocol. She unscrewed her own canteen and handed it to Friedrich without a word. Their fingers didn't touch, but their eyes met again, and this time the contact lasted longer. He nodded once, a gesture of gratitude that transcended language, and helped the younger man drink. When the boy had recovered enough to be taken to the camp infirmary, Friedrich returned the canteen to Maggie. Inside, she found a small piece of paper tucked into the cap. On it, written in careful English, were just 2 words: "Thank you." She should have reported it immediately. The note constituted forbidden communication, grounds for disciplinary action against both of them. Instead, Maggie folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. That night in her quarters, she read those 2 words again and again, trying to understand why such a simple message affected her so deeply. It wasn't gratitude for the water. It was gratitude for being seen as human, for being treated with basic decency in a situation where such treatment was rare. She burned the note before sleeping, watching the paper curl and blacken. But the words remained, inscribed somewhere deeper than paper could reach. October brought cooler temperatures and a subtle shift in the atmosphere at Camp Clarion. The initial tension between guards and prisoners had softened into something resembling routine coexistence. Men who had once glared at each other across the wire now exchanged brief nods during roll call. The Germans worked efficiently in the fields, and the American guards treated them with professional distance rather than open hostility. But beneath this surface calm, something dangerous was growing. After the incident with the canteen, Maggie found herself assigned to supervise Friedrich's work details more frequently than coincidence would explain. She suspected Sergeant Howard Chen, the facility's operations officer, was deliberately creating opportunities for certain guards and prisoners to interact. He had mentioned once during a staff meeting that cooperation produced better results than antagonism, a philosophy that made some of the older officers uncomfortable. The notes began appearing in unexpected places. Maggie would find a folded piece of paper tucked into the handle of a tool she was inspecting, or slipped between the pages of the work assignment clipboard. Friedrich's English improved with each message, his words becoming more complex and personal. He wrote about his life before the war, about teaching literature to teenagers in Munich, about his mother's garden and his father's bookshop. He asked careful questions about America, about Texas, about what life was like for women serving in the military. Maggie knew she should stop reading them. She knew she should definitely stop writing back. But somehow her responses found their way into the library cart she delivered to the prisoner barracks, hidden inside borrowed books that Friedrich had requested. She wrote about Philadelphia, about working in her father's printing shop before the war, about her brother Tommy, and how his death had shattered her family. She wrote about feeling trapped between duty and doubt, about wondering whether all Germans were truly the enemy, or if they were just men caught in circumstances beyond their control. Their correspondence became a secret dialogue that both knew was forbidden, but neither could abandon. Friedrich's handwriting was precise and elegant, the penmanship of an educated man. He quoted Goethe and Schiller, sharing pieces of German literature that had shaped his thinking. Maggie responded with Whitman and Dickinson, finding in poetry a language that could express what direct words could not. They were building a bridge across the wire, constructed from paper and ink, and the dangerous recognition that they understood each other in ways that defied the simple categories of enemy and ally. In one note, Friedrich wrote something that made Maggie's hands tremble as she read it in the privacy of her quarters. "In another life, in another time, I think we would have been friends. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of war, not the violence itself, but all the connections it prevents us from making." She folded the paper and added it to the small collection she kept hidden in a hollowed-out dictionary. Evidence of her betrayal, or proof of her humanity. She no longer knew which. November brought unexpected scrutiny to Camp Clarion. Colonel James Whitmore arrived from the War Department's Prisoner of War Division in Washington, accompanied by 2 military police investigators. Their stated purpose was routine inspection, but the camp's commanding officer, Major Richard Foster, knew better. Complaints had been filed by Mo civilian contractor, who claimed to have witnessed inappropriate interactions between guards and prisoners. The investigation began quietly. The MPs observed daily operations from a distance, taking notes on everything from meal distribution to work detail assignments. They photographed guards and prisoners during their interactions, timing conversations that seemed to extend beyond necessary communication. They interviewed camp staff individually, asking pointed questions about fraternization policies and whether those policies were being adequately enforced. Maggie felt their attention like a physical weight. She had been careful, or so she thought. But now every glance toward Friedrich felt exposed and dangerous. She stopped delivering library materials to the prisoner barracks, stopped supervising his work details, and maintained such rigid distance that other guards began to notice the change in her behavior. Sergeant Chen pulled her aside after morning formation on the investigation's 4th day. His expression was concerned rather than accusatory, which somehow made the conversation more difficult. "Corporal Brennan," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something. The relationships that form in places like this, they're complicated. These men aren't monsters, and recognizing their humanity doesn't make you a traitor." Maggie kept her eyes forward, her voice steady. "Sir, I maintain proper protocol with all prisoners." Chen nodded slowly. "I'm sure you do, but if there's anything you need to tell me, anything that might come out during this investigation, it's better I hear it from you first." She said nothing, and after a moment he dismissed her. But his words haunted her through the rest of her shift. How much did he know? How much had others seen? The investigation reached Friedrich's barracks on the 8th day. The MPs conducted searches, looking through personal belongings with methodical thoroughness. They confiscated letters, photographs, anything that might indicate inappropriate contact with American personnel. Friedrich watched with carefully controlled expression as they went through his footlocker, removing a small collection of books, a handmade chess set, letters from his mother in Germany. That evening, Maggie was called to Major Foster's office. Colonel Whitmore sat behind the desk while the major stood near the window, his face grim. On the desk lay a stack of papers, notes written in 2 different handwriting styles, some in English, some in German. Her notes, Friedrich's notes. Someone had found them, though she couldn't imagine how. The hiding places had been so careful, the exchanges so discreet. Colonel Whitmore spoke first, his voice cold and formal. "Corporal Brennan, you have been fraternizing with enemy prisoner Friedrich Weber in violation of standing orders and military regulations. Do you deny this?" Maggie's throat felt tight, but she met his gaze directly. "No, sir. I do not deny it." The investigation hung over Camp Clarion like a dark cloud through the remainder of November. Maggie had been placed on restricted duty, pending a formal hearing, reassigned to administrative tasks that kept her away from prisoner contact. Friedrich had been moved to a different barracks and assigned to work details supervised by male guards. The separation was complete and deliberate, a punishment that felt worse than any official sanction. But December brought an unexpected reprieve. Colonel Whitmore had returned to Washington, leaving Major Foster to navigate the situation with more flexibility than strict regulation would allow. The major was a career officer who had served in the First World War, and he had seen enough of human nature to understand that the heart rarely followed military protocol. He made a decision that surprised everyone. Rather than proceed immediately with court-martial charges, he would observe how the situation developed. If Corporal Brennan and prisoner Weber could maintain appropriate distance, if no further violations occurred, he might recommend leniency in his final report. Christmas preparations began in mid-December. The camp chaplain, Father Thomas O'Brien, proposed organizing a holiday celebration that would include both guards and prisoners. It was an unusual suggestion, one that would have been immediately rejected before the investigation. But Major Foster saw an opportunity. If the Americans and Germans could share a peaceful evening together under supervised conditions, It might demonstrate that mutual respect was possible without compromising security or discipline. The preparations brought the camp together in unexpected ways. Prisoners with carpentry skills built simple decorations from scrap wood. American guards contributed whatever they could from their own rations to supplement the special meal being planned. Even the civilian staff from the nearby town donated items, their initial hostility toward the Germans softening as they witnessed how the prisoners conducted themselves with dignity and gratitude. Maggie volunteered to help with the arrangements, hoping that visible cooperation with camp leadership might improve her standing. She worked alongside other WWII personnel, decorating the mess hall, hanging paper chains, and cutting snowflakes from old newspapers. She tried not to think about Friedrich, tried not to wonder if he thought about her during the long days of their enforced separation. The evening of December 24th arrived with unseasonable warmth. The mess hall had been transformed into something almost festive, despite the limitations of wartime and imprisonment. Long tables were arranged in rows, and for once, there would be no separation between guards and prisoners during the meal. Father O'Brien had insisted that Christmas demanded the breaking of ordinary barriers, even if just for one night. As the prisoners filed in, Maggie's heart jumped when she saw Friedrich enter with his barracks group. He had lost weight during the past month, his face thinner and more drawn. But when his eyes found hers across the crowded room, something passed between them that no investigation could touch. Recognition. Connection. The acknowledgement that whatever they had begun could not be simply erased by orders and regulations. The evening was just beginning, and neither of them knew that the events of this Christmas night would change the course of both their lives forever. The Christmas celebration proceeded with careful formality. Father O'Brien led prayers in both English and German, his words emphasizing peace and the shared humanity of all people. The meal was simple but abundant by wartime standards: roasted chicken with vegetables, fresh bread, and even small portions of apple pie donated by local families. Conversation remained cautious at first, guards and prisoners sitting at the same tables but maintaining polite distance in their interactions. But as the evening progressed, something shifted. Sergeant Chen began asking one of the German prisoners about his family's farm in Bavaria, discovering they both had agricultural backgrounds. Two young guards from Oklahoma started teaching a group of prisoners an American card game, laughter erupting when language barriers led to amusing misunderstandings. The rigid boundaries that had defined every interaction for months began to soften, not disappearing entirely, but becoming less impenetrable. Maggie found herself seated 3 tables away from Friedrich, close enough to observe him but far enough to maintain the appearance of propriety. She watched him translate conversations for prisoners whose English remained limited, watched him laugh at a joke one of the American guards told, watched the way he seemed to exist in 2 worlds simultaneously, present in the moment, yet carrying the weight of everything that separated them. Near the end of the meal, Father O'Brien announced that several prisoners had prepared musical performances. Friedrich stood with 5 other Germans, and together they sang Stille Nacht in its original German. Their voices blended beautifully, filling the mess hall with haunting harmony. When they finished, Father O'Brien invited everyone to sing it together in English as Silent Night. The sound of American and German voices joining in the familiar carol created a moment that transcended the war itself. After the organized program ended, people began moving around the room more freely. Major Foster had authorized 1 hour of informal socializing, an unprecedented relaxation of normal restrictions. Maggie knew she should stay away from Friedrich, knew that any interaction would be observed and noted. But when she saw him standing alone near the window, looking out at the dark Texas night, she couldn't stop herself from walking over. They stood side by side, not quite touching, staring through their reflections in the glass. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, Friedrich's voice, quiet enough that only she could hear, broke the silence. "I have missed our conversations, Margaret." She had never heard him say her full name before. It sounded different in his slight accent, softer somehow, more intimate. "I know," she whispered back. "This has to stop, Friedrich. We both know it can't continue." He nodded slowly, still not looking at her directly. "I know, But knowing something must end does not make it easier to accept. He paused, then added, "In my country, there is a saying, Das Herz hat seine Gründe, die der Verstand nicht kennt." The heart has its reasons that reason does not know. Before Maggie could respond, Sergeant Chen appeared at her elbow, his expression gentle but firm. "Corporal Brennan, Major Foster would like to see you in his office." Major Foster's office felt smaller than usual, with 3 people crowded inside. Maggie stood at attention while the major sat behind his desk, Sergeant Chen positioned near the door. The Christmas celebration continued in the mess hall, distant sounds of conversation and occasional laughter filtering through the walls, a stark contrast to the tension in the room. The major gestured for her to sit, a gesture that somehow made Maggie more nervous than if he had kept her standing. He opened a folder on his desk, scanning documents she recognized as personnel files and incident reports. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and careful. "Corporal Brennan, I'm going to be direct with you. Colonel Whitmore wants to proceed with formal charges against you for fraternization with an enemy prisoner. The evidence is substantial. Written correspondence, witness statements from other guards who observed extended conversations, documented violations of protocol." Maggie's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Yes, sir. I understand." Major Foster leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "What I need to understand is the nature of your relationship with prisoner Weber. Was this simply poor judgment, or is there something more significant happening here?" The question hung in the air, demanding honesty that could destroy what remained of her military career. Maggie thought about lying, about minimizing what had grown between her and Friedrich. But she was tired of pretending, tired of treating genuine human connection as something criminal. "Sir, Friedrich Weber is an intelligent, kind, and honorable man who happens to have been born in the wrong country at the wrong time. Our conversations began as simple exchanges, but they evolved into something deeper. A friendship. Perhaps more than that. I don't know how to explain it except to say that getting to know him has challenged everything I thought I understood about this war." Sergeant Chen shifted slightly near the door, but his expression revealed nothing. Major Foster nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "And if I asked you to have no further contact with Weber, to treat him as you would any other prisoner, could you do that?" Maggie hesitated, understanding that her answer might determine her future in the military. "Sir, I can follow orders, but I cannot change what I've come to feel. And I won't pretend that those feelings don't exist." The major closed the folder and stood, walking to the window that overlooked the camp grounds. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, becoming less formal and more human. "There are 14 similar cases under investigation across POW camps in this country, Corporal. 14 documented instances of American personnel developing inappropriate relationships with German prisoners. Some are worse than yours, some less severe. But all of them present the same fundamental problem. How do we maintain discipline and order when basic human nature refuses to recognize the boundaries we try to impose?" He turned back to face her. "I'm not going to court-martial you. Not yet. But I am transferring you to different duties, effective immediately." The transfer orders came through on December 27th. Maggie would be reassigned to administrative duties at the regional WWII headquarters in San Antonio, 300 miles from Camp Clarion. The move would be permanent, removing any possibility of contact with Friedrich or the other prisoners. She had 3 days to prepare for departure, 3 days to say goodbye to the life she had built at the camp, however complicated that life had become. But before she could leave, Major Foster called another meeting. This time, the room was more crowded. 4 other guards sat waiting when Maggie arrived, 2 men and 2 women, all wearing expressions of worry and resignation. She recognized them all, fellow personnel who had been part of the Christmas celebration, who had worked closely with the prisoners over the past months. Sergeant Chen stood at the front of the room, a stack of files on the table before him. His face was grave as he addressed the group. "I'm going to speak plainly because we don't have time for anything else. Each of you has been flagged in Colonel Whitmore's investigation for inappropriate fraternization with German prisoners. Some of you have been more careful than others, but all of you have crossed lines that should not have been crossed. Private Daniel Walsh, a guard from Boston who had turned 21 just before shipping to Texas, spoke up. "Sergeant, I know what the regulations say, but these men aren't what we were told to expect. They're not fanatics or monsters. They're just soldiers who lost a battle." Chen nodded slowly. "I understand that, Walsh. I've seen it myself. But understanding doesn't change the rules, and it doesn't protect any of us from the consequences of breaking them." He opened the first file, pulling out photographs that made Maggie's breath catch. They showed Private Walsh playing chess with a German prisoner during rec time, Corporal Janet Hughes sharing her lunch with a prisoner who appeared ill, Sergeant Michael Torres teaching English phrases to a small group of Germans. And there were more photographs of Maggie herself, images she hadn't known were being taken, showing her standing close to Friedrich, their body language revealing an intimacy that no amount of denial could explain. The evidence was overwhelming, not just against Maggie, but against all of them, Chen continued, his voice heavy. "Major Foster has given me authorization to offer you all a choice. Accept immediate transfers to other facilities with letters of reprimand in your files, or face formal court-martial proceedings." Corporal Hughes, a 32-year-old nurse from Virginia, spoke next. "What happens to the prisoners? To the men we've been accused of fraternizing with?" Chen's expression darkened. "They'll be transferred to a higher security facility in Oklahoma, one with stricter protocols and less freedom. The Major believes separating everyone involved is the only way to contain the situation before it spreads further." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Their choices had consequences, not just for themselves, but for the prisoners who had done nothing wrong except respond to kindness with trust. Maggie felt anger rising in her chest, anger at the unfairness of punishing human decency as if it were a crime. Maggie made her decision that night. While the other guards accepted their transfers, choosing self-preservation over principle, she requested a formal hearing. If the military wanted to charge her with fraternization, she would force them to do it publicly, to present their evidence and justify why basic human compassion constituted a criminal offense. Major Foster tried to dissuade her from this path. He called her to his office privately, his demeanor more paternal than commanding. "Corporal Brennan, I admire your integrity, but you need to understand what you're risking. A court-martial conviction could mean dishonorable discharge, loss of all benefits, and a permanent mark on your record that will follow you for the rest of your life." Maggie stood straight, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Sir, with respect, I've already lost what matters most. If I accept a transfer and a reprimand, I'm admitting that what happened between Friedrich and me was wrong. I can't do that. I won't do that." The Major sighed deeply. "You're a good soldier, Brennan. That's what makes this so damn difficult. You've never shirked duty, never complained, never caused trouble until this. But the regulations exist for a reason. Sir, may I ask you something?" He nodded. "Have the regulations made any of us safer? Has treating these prisoners like dangerous enemies prevented any escapes or incidents? Or has the opposite approach, treating them like human beings, created a more stable and cooperative environment?" Major Foster didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were careful. "What you're describing might work in peacetime, Corporal, but we're at war. The rules are designed to maintain clear boundaries because without those boundaries, everything becomes complicated and dangerous." "It's already complicated, sir. Pretending otherwise doesn't change that." 2 days later, formal charges were filed. Corporal Margaret Brennan was accused of violating Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, failure to obey order or regulation, specifically the prohibition against fraternization with enemy prisoners of war. The court-martial was scheduled for January 15, 1944, to be held at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. The military moved quickly to transfer the implicated prisoners before news of the case could spread. Friedrich and 8 other Germans were loaded onto transport trucks in the early morning darkness, given no warning and no opportunity to say goodbye to anyone. Maggie watched from her barracks window as the convoy pulled away, her hand pressed against the cold glass. Sergeant Chen found her there an hour later. He stood beside her in silence before speaking. "He left something for you. Asked me to make sure you got it." He handed her a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. Inside was a carved wooden bird, no bigger than her thumb, crafted with remarkable detail. Friedrich must have spent weeks working on it in secret, using whatever tools he could find. With it was a note, just a few words in his careful handwriting. Vögel können nicht in Käfigen leben. Birds cannot truly live in cages, neither can we. News of Maggie's court-martial spread through the nearby town of Clarion faster than anyone anticipated. The small Texas community of 3,000 people had initially viewed the POW camp with suspicion and resentment. German prisoners working American soil while local boys died overseas seemed like an insult to everything they held sacred. But over the months, attitudes had begun to shift in unexpected ways. Local farmers, who had initially protested the use of POW labor in their fields, grudgingly admitted that the German prisoners worked harder and more efficiently than they expected. The prisoners had helped bring in the cotton harvest when local labor shortages threatened to leave crops rotting. They had repaired irrigation systems and rebuilt fences damaged in storms. Their contribution had been undeniable, and it became difficult to maintain pure hatred for men who were helping to sustain the community's economy. When word spread that a female guard was facing court-martial for showing kindness to the prisoners, the town split into hostile camps. Reverend William Patterson of First Baptist Church delivered a fiery sermon condemning any sympathy toward the enemy. He stood in his pulpit on the first Sunday of January and declared that fraternization with Germans was a betrayal of every American soldier fighting overseas, a moral corruption that threatened the very foundations of their society. His congregation responded with enthusiastic amens, their anger fueled by grief for sons and husbands serving in harm's way. But across town at St. Mary's Catholic Church, Father Miguel Ortega offered a different perspective. He spoke about the parable of the Good Samaritan, about Christ's commandment to love one's enemies, about the difference between a nation's evil leadership and the individual souls caught in its machinery. His homily was quieter, more contemplative, but it resonated with those who had begun to question whether hatred was truly the Christian response to captive enemies who posed no threat. The town's newspaper, the Clarion Observer, ran competing editorials that reflected the division. Editor Harold Green published an opinion piece titled "When Duty Becomes Treason," arguing that military discipline existed for essential reasons and that Corporal Brennan's actions undermined the war effort. His wife, Sarah Green, who wrote the Society column, responded with her own piece called "The Humanity We Cannot Afford to Lose," describing the prisoners as young men far from home who deserved basic human decency, regardless of the uniform they once wore. The debate spilled into every corner of community life. Arguments erupted at the general store, in the diner, at school board meetings where parents disagreed about what values they wanted to teach their children. Some families stopped speaking to neighbors over the issue. Others found themselves questioning beliefs they had held without examination since the war began. Mary Henderson, who owned the boarding house where several WWII personnel rented rooms, organized a petition supporting Maggie. Within a week, she had collected 200 signatures from townspeople who believed that compassion should not be criminalized. But Reverend Patterson countered with his own petition, demanding the strictest possible punishment, gathering nearly 300 names from his congregation and their allies. The town of Clarion had become a microcosm of a larger question facing America. How should a nation at war treat its enemies? The court-martial proceedings began on January 15th as scheduled, but events across the Atlantic would soon make the case both more complicated and more urgent. Allied forces were advancing through Europe with increasing momentum. By February, the end of the war in Europe seemed inevitable rather than hopeful speculation. And with that certainty came new questions about what would happen to the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners held in camps across America. Maggie's hearing took place in a sparse military courtroom at Fort Sam Houston. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically. Photographs of her interactions with Friedrich, testimony from guards who had witnessed their conversations, the confiscated notes written in 2 different hands. The case was straightforward from a legal standpoint. She had violated clearly stated regulations, and she had admitted to doing so. Her defense attorney, Captain Lewis Bradford, argued that the regulations themselves were being applied inconsistently across different camps, that no actual harm had resulted from her actions, and that her exemplary service record should be considered in mitigation. But Captain Bradford's strongest argument was one he saved for his closing statement. He stood before the panel of officers and asked them to consider what world they wanted to build after the war ended. Would it be one where hatred and suspicion remained entrenched, where former enemies could never become anything else? Or would it be one where people could recognize their shared humanity, even across the deepest divides? The panel deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their verdict was guilty, but their sentence reflected ambivalence about the case itself. Maggie would receive a reduction in rank to private, forfeit 2 months' pay, and be transferred from Camp Clarion permanently. But she would not face dishonorable discharge or imprisonment. It was a compromise verdict, one that satisfied no one completely, but allowed everyone to move forward. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Victory in Europe Day brought celebrations across America, church bells ringing and crowds filling streets in jubilant relief. But in POW camps from Texas to New York, the victory brought profound uncertainty. What happened now to the captured German soldiers? When would they be repatriated? What country would they be returning to? Friedrich Weber sat in his barracks at the Oklahoma facility where he had been transferred, reading letters from his mother that had finally caught up with him after months of silence. Munich had been devastated by Allied bombing. His father's bookshop no longer existed. Their family home had been reduced to rubble. His younger sister had died in an air raid the previous November. His mother was living with relatives in a village outside the ruined city, struggling to find enough food to survive. The letter asked when he would be coming home, but Friedrich no longer knew how to answer that question. What was he returning to? A country destroyed, a family shattered, a future that seemed to hold nothing but poverty and reconstruction. And somewhere in Texas, or perhaps reassigned elsewhere, there was a woman he had known for only a few months, but who had shown him what it meant to connect with someone across every boundary that should have kept them apart. Repatriation procedures began in June of 1945, but the process moved slowly. The logistics of transporting hundreds of thousands of prisoners back to Europe were staggering, and the situation in occupied Germany remained chaotic. Allied authorities needed to process each prisoner, screening for potential war criminals and Nazi Party officials before allowing them to return home. For ordinary soldiers like Friedrich, repatriation seemed inevitable but not immediate. He received his processing date in early July. He would be transported to a collection point in New Jersey, then loaded onto a ship bound for Southampton, England, before being transferred to the British occupation zone in Germany. The timeline gave him approximately 3 weeks before he would leave American soil forever. During those 3 weeks, Friedrich wrestled with a decision that kept him awake through long Oklahoma nights. Every practical consideration told him to return to Germany. His mother needed him. His country, however broken and guilty of unspeakable crimes, needed millions of men like him to rebuild from the ruins. Running away to pursue an impossible relationship with an American woman he had known briefly would be cowardice, selfishness, abandonment of his duties as a son and citizen, but his heart argued differently. In Germany, he would return to a society still poisoned by the ideology that had led to catastrophic war. He would face suspicion from both occupying forces, who saw all Germans as complicit in Nazi crimes, and from fellow Germans who would view his time in American captivity as corruption by enemy influence. He would rebuild a life in the shadow of incomprehensible guilt, forever associated with a regime whose full horrors he was only beginning to understand. In America, despite everything, he had glimpsed the possibility of a different kind of life. He had experienced what it meant to be treated as an individual, rather than as a representative of a hated nation. He had discovered that he could form connections with former enemies, that human understanding could transcend the categories that war tried to impose. And he had met Margaret Brennan, whose courage and kindness had shown him that love could exist even in the most unlikely circumstances. The question that haunted him was whether that love was real or simply a product of proximity and extraordinary circumstances. They had shared notes and brief conversations, a few stolen moments during a Christmas celebration, nothing that would constitute a relationship in ordinary life. Yet, the connection felt deeper than the sum of those limited interactions. He carried the memory of her face, her voice, her way of looking at him as if she saw who he truly was, rather than what his uniform represented. Friedrich wrote letters he never sent, trying to articulate his confusion to Margaret, to his mother, to himself. How did you choose between duty and desire when both seemed equally valid? How did you know whether you were following your heart or simply running from responsibility? He had been trained as a soldier to follow orders, to subordinate personal wishes to larger purposes. But the war had ended, and now he had to decide for himself what kind of man he wanted to become and where he wanted to build whatever remained of his life. Maggie had been reassigned to a supply depot in Arizona, processing equipment returns from training facilities across the Southwest. The work was mindless and safe, exactly the kind of assignment given to soldiers the military wanted to forget about. She spent her days filling out forms and checking inventory lists, her mind always elsewhere, wondering where Friedrich had been sent and whether he ever thought about her. She received her answer in late July through an unexpected source. Sergeant Chen, who had been transferred to administrative duties in Washington, tracked her down through military channels. His letter arrived with a second envelope inside, postmarked from Oklahoma. Friedrich had somehow gotten a letter to Chen, trusting the sergeant who had shown them both quiet compassion during the investigation. The sergeant had taken the risk of forwarding it, including a note of his own. Some things matter more than regulations. Be careful, but be brave. Friedrich's letter was 10 pages long, written in English that had continued to improve during their separation. He wrote about his mother's situation, about the devastation waiting for him in Germany, about the impossible choice he faced. But more than that, he wrote about what their brief connection had meant to him, how it had changed his understanding of who he could become. He ended with a question that made Maggie's hands shake as she read it. If there were a way for me to stay in America, if such a thing were possible, would you want me to try? I need to know before I make my decision. The question was almost absurd in its complications. Friedrich was an enemy prisoner of war, with no legal status beyond that designation. He had no visa, no sponsor, no grounds for remaining in the country once repatriation procedures were complete. Even if he could somehow avoid being shipped back to Germany, he would be an illegal resident subject to arrest and deportation, and any American who helped him would face serious criminal charges. But Maggie found herself researching possibilities anyway, spending her limited free time in the base library, reading immigration law and regulations governing enemy aliens. She discovered that the situation was more fluid than she expected. Congress was debating legislation that would allow some German prisoners to remain in America as agricultural workers if they could secure employment sponsors. The labor shortage created by the war had made certain industries desperate for workers, and some lawmakers argued that repatriating trained workers back to Germany made little economic sense. The proposed legislation faced fierce opposition from veterans groups and patriotic organizations who viewed it as a betrayal of American soldiers. But it also had surprising support from farmers and businessmen who had employed POW labor and found them to be reliable workers. The bill was stalled in committee, its fate uncertain but not impossible. Maggie wrote back to Friedrich, her letter equally long and far more honest than she had allowed herself to be in their earlier notes. She told him about the proposed legislation, about the slim possibility it represented, But more importantly, she told him the truth about her feelings, words she had been too afraid to write before. "I don't know if what we feel is love or something else born of extraordinary circumstances, but I know I want the chance to find out." As Maggie investigated possibilities for Friedrich to remain in America, she discovered they were far from alone in their predicament. Across the country, similar stories were unfolding in dozens of POW camps. The phenomenon had become significant enough that military officials could no longer dismiss it as isolated incidents of poor judgment. It was a pattern, one that revealed something fundamental about human nature that regulations had failed to account for. Private Daniel Walsh, who had been transferred from Camp Clarion, along with Maggie, had maintained contact with a German prisoner named Hans Müller. Their relationship had begun over chess games and evolved into genuine friendship. Hans had been a university student before the war, studying mathematics in Berlin, and he shared Walsh's passion for solving complex problems. When Hans faced repatriation, Walsh's family in Boston had offered to sponsor him as a farm worker, despite having no farm and knowing nothing about agriculture. The absurdity of the arrangement didn't matter. They were willing to navigate whatever legal fiction was necessary to help Hans stay. Corporal Janet Hughes had fallen in love with a prisoner named Otto Schneider, a former medic who had assisted her in the camp infirmary. Their connection had been immediate and undeniable, built on shared dedication to healing and countless hours working side by side to care for sick and injured prisoners. Otto's wife had been killed in the bombing of Dresden, leaving him with no family to return to in Germany. Janet had written to her congressman, to military officials, to anyone who might have authority to grant exceptions. Her letters were passionate and articulate, arguing that Otto's medical skills were desperately needed in rural Virginia, where she planned to work after her discharge. Stories emerged from camps in Wisconsin, Montana, Colorado, and California. American women who had served as guards, nurses, and administrators had formed attachments to German prisoners that defied simple categorization. Some were clearly romantic relationships, love that had bloomed despite every obstacle. Others were deep friendships, connections between people who had discovered unexpected common ground. A few were surrogate family bonds, American women who had lost brothers or sons in the war, finding something like healing in helping German prisoners who reminded them of their lost loved ones. The military's initial response had been predictable outrage and punishment. But as the number of cases grew, some officials began to reconsider. Colonel Robert Morrison, who oversaw POW operations for the southwestern region, wrote a controversial memo suggesting that these relationships might actually serve American interests. German prisoners who wanted to remain in America, who had formed positive connections with Americans, represented the best possible ambassadors for democracy. They had experienced American values firsthand and chosen them over returning to their homeland. Wasn't that exactly the kind of transformation America hoped to achieve in occupied Germany? His memo was leaked to newspapers and sparked fierce debate. Editorials appeared in major publications arguing both sides. Some viewed the relationships as treasonous fraternization that dishonored American soldiers. Others saw them as evidence of America's moral superiority, proof that democratic values could win hearts even among former enemies. The debate reached Congress, where representatives added amendments to the proposed agricultural worker legislation that would specifically address the POW relationship cases. Meanwhile, the prisoners and their American friends waited in limbo, their futures dependent on political battles they could neither influence nor predict. Friedrich received word that his repatriation had been delayed pending review of his case. Someone, he didn't know who, had flagged his file for special consideration. The delay gave him hope, but also extended the agonizing uncertainty. Every day that passed was another day wondering if he was making the right choice. Another day his mother waited alone in Germany. Another day the possibility of a future with Maggie felt both more real and more impossible. The legislation passed in September of 1945, though in a form so compromised and restricted that it satisfied almost no one. German prisoners could apply to remain in America as agricultural or industrial workers if they met strict criteria. They needed employment sponsors, housing arrangements, character references from camp commanders, and proof that their repatriation would cause unusual hardship. The approval process could take months, and fewer than 5% of applicants were expected to qualify. Friedrich submitted his application with documentation that Maggie had helped compile from Arizona. Major Foster, despite everything, had written a character reference describing Friedrich as a model prisoner who had demonstrated genuine remorse for his country's actions and sincere desire to embrace American values. Sergeant Chen added his own letter, as did Father O'Brien from Camp Clarion. The employment sponsor came from an unexpected source. Mary Henderson, the boarding house owner who had befriended Maggie, had a brother who owned a printing business in San Antonio. He needed workers and was willing to take a chance on a former school teacher with no printing experience but obvious intelligence and work ethic. The approval came through in November, 3 days before Friedrich's scheduled deportation. He was granted a 1-year work visa with possibility of extension, subject to regular reporting requirements and restrictions on travel. It was conditional freedom, probationary acceptance, but it was enough. He boarded a bus to San Antonio with a single suitcase containing everything he owned, his heart pounding with equal measures of hope and terror about what he was choosing. Maggie had been granted leave to meet him. They saw each other for the first time in nearly a year at the San Antonio bus station, both of them older and worn by everything they had endured. The reunion was awkward at first, the reality of standing face to face more complicated than the romantic reunion both had imagined. They had built a relationship on letters and stolen moments, and now they had to discover whether that foundation could support actual daily life together. They didn't rush into anything. Friedrich found a room in a working-class boarding house near the printing shop. Maggie remained on base, completing the final months of her enlistment. They met for dinners once or twice a week, careful public meetings in restaurants where they talked about everything and nothing. Friedrich described his work learning the printing trade, the strange satisfaction of creating something tangible with his hands. Maggie talked about her plans after discharge, her uncertainty about what kind of life she wanted to build. Slowly, carefully, they began to truly know each other outside the intensity of their camp experience. They discovered they disagreed about music, that Friedrich loved opera while Maggie preferred jazz. They found they shared a passion for literature and could spend hours discussing books. Friedrich's sense of humor was drier than she expected, full of subtle observations that made her laugh unexpectedly. Maggie's temper was sharper than he had seen at camp, her opinions more forceful when she felt safe enough to express them fully. It wasn't the fairy tale romance that observers might have imagined. It was something more real and more valuable. Two people learning whether the connection forged in impossible circumstances could survive in ordinary life. 25 years after Friedrich Weber stepped off that bus in San Antonio, he stood in the backyard of the home he had built with his own hands, watching his daughter play with her children. It was 1970, and the world had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible during those dark days of war and captivity. Germany had risen from ruins to become an economic powerhouse. America had fought and struggled through other conflicts, other divisions. But here, in this modest San Antonio neighborhood, something enduring had taken root. Friedrich had become Friedrich Brennan, taking Maggie's surname when they married in 1947. The decision had been practical at first, a way to avoid the suspicion and hostility that still clung to German names in the years immediately after the war. But it had become something more, a symbol of the new identity he had chosen, the life he had built on American soil. He had eventually become a citizen, raised 2 children who knew they were half German, but thought of themselves as fully American, and built a successful printing business that employed 15 people. Maggie emerged from the house carrying lemonade, her auburn hair now streaked with gray, her face lined by time but still carrying the same direct gaze that had first caught his attention across the wire at Camp Clarion. They had weathered difficult years, times when Friedrich's nightmares about the war made sleep impossible, periods when Maggie struggled with guilt about the family Friedrich had left behind in Germany. His mother had eventually forgiven him for choosing to stay in America, understanding that sometimes love required difficult choices. She had visited twice before her death, meeting her grandchildren and marveling at the life her son had created so far from home. Other couples from the camp days had not been as fortunate. Some relationships had collapsed under the weight of cultural differences and societal pressure. Daniel Walsh and Hans Mueller had remained close friends, but both eventually married other people, their wartime bond evolving into something different but still meaningful. Janet Hughes and Otto Schneider had married and built a life together in Virginia, though they faced years of ostracism from neighbors who could not forgive Otto's nationality. But enough had succeeded that the story became part of American mythology. Books and articles appeared about the POW romances, some sensationalized and inaccurate, others thoughtfully exploring what these relationships revealed about human nature and the possibility of reconciliation. Sociologists studied them as examples of how proximity and shared humanity could overcome even the deepest prejudices. Friedrich and Maggie rarely spoke publicly about their story. They had learned that some people wanted to make them symbols of something larger, while others wanted to condemn them as traitors to their respective countries. They preferred the quiet dignity of the life they had built, the daily reality of partnership and family that needed no justification beyond its own existence. As the sun set over their backyard, Friedrich reached for Maggie's hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. She smiled at him, and in that smile he saw everything they had risked and everything they had gained. They had been enemies who became friends, friends who became lovers, lovers who became partners in building a life that honored the best of both their cultures while transcending the worst of their shared history. It was not a perfect love story, but it was real, enduring, and profoundly human.